evening, ladies and gentlemen, my fellow travelers on planet Earth. We live in an interdependent world. I am no one special, merely an heir to India's great civilizational heritage that has pioneered the most sophisticated mind training techniques in human history. And thousands of years of, in a sense, product testing have led to their evolution and to their credibility and continuing impact. And I just thought I'd dwell briefly on a few of the elements of this civilizational heritage. But I would like to start with a brief supplication to the wisdom aspect of this tradition. In our Buddhist tradition, we subscribe to a deity, a visualization, an image of Manjushri, the Buddha aspects of wisdom. And so, Om Vakila Namaha. So this is, I celebrate the word, I celebrate knowledge. And that juxtaposes, I think uniquely again in our tradition, the aspect of practice, method. So it's not enough to really know and have a sense of the philosophical ideas that underline our heritage, but what are the methodologies, the techniques, the practices that make it real? In the tradition that I am heir to, the essence of that is compassion. And the Dalai Lama is considered the embodiment, the incarnation of Avalokiteshvara, the Buddhist aspect of compassion. And the prayer to him, the supplication to him, is Om Mani Padme Hum. So this in a sense sets the tone for the conversation on the idea of the method and the idea of wisdom. And why do we need that method as importantly as we need the wisdom? And we are usually exposed to intellectual ideas that we are excited by, that we find interesting, that we find appealing, we find engaging, but at the end of the day, they do not sufficiently impact our deepest reflexive responses. And unless that our responses are sufficiently transformed, the wisdom is really useful. It is a kind of, how do I put it, well, for want of a better phrase, intellectual masturbation. We just sort of keep looking at the ideas and talking about the ideas and holding them forth without really them transforming us. And so it is our sense of the self, the I, the me, the mine. Tomorrow I'll have the great privilege of a conversation with Punita where we will explore the idea of consciousness, but the self that observes the consciousness is the same self that experiences emotions, that experiences pain and suffering. And we have somehow begun to delude ourselves that we can, whether we use alternative medicine or alternative therapies, that we can somehow escape pain, illness, suffering, loss, the death of those we love, our own transitions. And so we get obsessed with affirming our sense of self and protecting ourself from the true nature and the true experience of reality. So the method that this really explores is the method of the techniques and practices that can help us diminish our sense of the self that suffers. Because let us not forget that the Indian yogi who sits in the high mountains isn't really engaging in the best practices of wholesome living, in a sense of, the perfect diet and even exercise. And he is able to give himself an unending, expansive bliss purely through working with the mind. And that really is the significance of the mind. And it is unfortunate that in our times we spend so much time training ourselves for our careers, beautifying ourselves, developing our bodies, and acquiring knowledge that will enable us to earn more money and to be able to engage in more productive, successful careers, and engage in relationships that will somehow compensate for our own lack of sensibility, of emotions, of fullness, of completeness, instead of spending any time, substantial time, in training our minds. And so, what our heritage really makes the case for is the priority, really, of the mind. So while it is no doubt possible through posture and breathing and through diet and other sort of therapies of alternative medicine to influence the mind, but in fact, if the mind is trained to its full potential, it is capable of controlling all these elements. And we also somehow assume that if we have imbibed the right techniques and processes, that we can escape the suffering of, or the pain, or the dissatisfaction of old age, sickness and death. Because many of the greatest spiritual masters from, and some of you will be familiar with them, Sri Ramakrishna got cancer, Ramana Maharishi had cancer, and Aurobindo suffered illness and pain and isolated himself when he was going through that period. So despite all those practices, that pain or the sensation of pain was inevitable. So what can we do about it? I mean, do we just surrender and say that life is difficult and so it shall be, and we are going to have to live with it? So our approach really is, and yesterday a very eloquent cardiologist was talking about stress and how stress aggravated cardiological conditions and heart disease. Of course stress does, but stress is inevitable. How can you not be moved if you see someone suffer, or COVID is erupting around you? So we phrase it in a manner that it is possible to diminish the suffering of suffering. So whereas suffering is inevitable, because we have a distorted sense of reality, we have a distorted sense of what life is really like and what the experience of life will be, we suffer twice over. We suffer the sensations of pain and discomfort and loss, but we can not suffer that suffering. So stress is an embodiment of the fright and flight response, and there are enough doctors, there are even a small audience, who will tell you that the flight and fright response is essential to human survival. It is when the flight and fright response refuses or fails to switch off, you get continuing stress beyond the stress that you need to deal with the moment. And of course, if the stimulus for stress is a prolonged one, then we continue to suffer the effects of stress. But we can recognize stress for what it is, and this is where some of the practices, like the yoga sessions that were going on, when yoga is completely understood, fully understood. Let me give you an anecdote I was deeply privileged to be a student of the great yoga teacher B.K. Iyengar. And so there is the whole Iyengar school of yoga. And when I went to see Guruji, as we called him, about a few months before he died at the age of 96, he was still very fit. And he was in a very complex asana for hours. And the family was very upset, and I went and said, Guruji, what's going on? You're not well. And he said that there are still parts of my body that my consciousness has not reached. And so this very intimate relationship between body, awareness, and consciousness. And that is really proved by just simple body language. So if I'm not feeling as bright this morning as I should, my shoulders will slump. My sense, I'm a little sluggish, the microphone falls off. A little paper that I had kept, that I should refer to, flew by the side. It's because my body was carrying the imprint of my mental state. But by reversing that through proper asanas, so if I stand up and I become aware of the sensations in my body, I can release the imprints in my physical form of my mental states. But it is only by explicitly addressing the mind and the training of the mind can I prevent those mental states from arising in the first place. So, while yoga asana is a process of sensitization when sort of practiced with the motivation and objectives assigned to it of enabling us to become aware through the sensations of the body as to what is happening in our minds. But if our sensibility gets locked in to the physical form of the body and begins to then perfect the body perhaps in a competitive environment, because I see the person next to me performing an asana and I want to do it better. And the minute that motivation starts, or I begin to push myself beyond reasonable, that fine threshold of pain. So a very important component of physical yoga is that how much you push yourself, or shall I just say nudge yourself when you're doing an asana. If you do too little, it fails. If you do too much, it fails. And historically, yoga was used as a one-on-one teaching technique, and in small groups where it was possible for a teacher to engage individually with each student. Now we have yoga on television, and as I was just talking to Dr. Singh, that for example, if you have hernia and someone teaches you how to pump your stomach, you're in pretty serious trouble. That's just an extreme case of the risk of that. Anyway, we switch to, move back to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and what I learned from him as a student. When I first went up to Dharamsala in the early 1980s, I saw that the monks who prayed, their prayer mats said, "Pray for the Chinese." And we hear so much of genocide these days, and the Chinese, according to the International Commission for Human Rights, had held that the Chinese had been guilty of genocide in Tibet. But here were these monks who were praying for the Chinese, and what were they praying? They were praying, "May the veils of ignorance lift from the Chinese." So two important lessons from that the innate state of the mind is pure. And by pure, I don't mean that it has no imprints on the consciousness and it's somehow pure without any imprints of any kind, any predispositions, whether it's genes or previous karma or previous actions. But it is ignorant of the true nature of reality. And what is that true nature of reality that we need to assimilate, understand, and internalize so that we can be free from the suffering of suffering? And it stands really on three pillars. And of course there is an infinite variety of nuance to each one of these. And so when I started with the idea of interconnectedness, when I spoke of the butterfly flapping its wings in the rainforests of the Amazon and that leading to a tornado, it isn't that the butterfly is actually flapping a wing and that creates these ripples that does that. It's that in the larger interconnectedness of the planet, it's sort of like a last straw of the balance that, when disturbed, can disrupt the world. And so if we pause to reflect on the number of people who make our everyday lives possible. You know, coffee is the great American passion. You wake up in the morning, you grab your cup of coffee, it gives you a charge and you get through the day. But have we ever reflected on where that coffee came from? Who grew that coffee? You know, the coffee grower in Brazil or Costa Rica, the guy who's growing the coffee, the machine that he's using to harvest the coffee. The coffee gets transported to the United States, it gets packaged, it's served to you. So every element of our lives is serviced, is provided for by a large chain of interconnected actions and initiatives. So our very survival, from the fertilization of the egg and the sperm, the coming together of our parents, is an action that makes our very existence and our very survival possible. And yet we remain completely indifferent or ignorant or shut our eyes to the idea of interdependence. The second aspect is, the second pillar as it were, is impermanence and change. Everything changes. So the new car that we have aspired to buy all our lives, whatever form and model that is, will get its first scratch, and then its second scratch. And very soon we'll be tired of it, and we will replace it. And that's what we also do with many of our relationships. We create an expectation of our relationship, and then the minute that relationship fails to, or ceases to, or it's servicing our needs, reduces, we become tired of it, and we replace a human being as a commodity because of our predisposition for change, avoiding change. And the third aspect is, that relates to this idea of impermanence, is that every facet, every quality of our lives, from the relationship we are in or out of, or the car, is subject to causes and conditions. They do not exist independent of causes and conditions. A very good example of that, to go back to coffee, is to just turn coffee into ice cream. Now, coffee ice cream exists only so long as the causes and conditions that circumscribe ice cream exist. So as the temperature goes up, the ice cream melts. It is no longer ice cream. And if you apply that principle, you will see from Mount Everest to the physical universe on that planet, everything is moving. Mount Everest is inching up or millimetering up every year. Every element of anything that exists depends on causes and conditions and does not have an independent, isolated existence. I've just flown in from Delhi 2 days ago, where the air quality index, which according to the WHO should be 50, is now 450. So the causes and conditions that have created my cough and phlegm in the chest are external to me, and at least in the short, immediate term, out of my control. And so the minute we recognize that our very existence and all the elements of our experience are not independent, and ultimately the recognition that the self, the I, that suffers or experiences suffering, or the suffering of suffering, is also not independent. Because when you start looking for the I, you will never find the I. Because the I is a designation. Just as this music stand is the designation. It is made up of this little piece of steel, it is made up of all these different elements of it. And when does it stop being a stand? Or when does a car stop being a car. If you remove one wheel, is it still a car? The second wheel, not a car? When is it, any element, you will find that it is only what it is when it is made up of the parts or the elements that we expect to have of it. And that is when that object begins. And it is the same thing as the self. Now, does the self exist when a person is in a coma? If you believe in reincarnation, is it the same self that takes rebirth? Does the self have substance? Is it made of something? And then how is the self different from consciousness? These are some of the things we hope to talk about tomorrow. That when does the mind how does the mind relate to the self? What is the relationship to the self but the body? And when does the self cease to be? Does it ever cease to be? Etc., etc., etc. So, the minute we recognize these elements, then our sense of self softens. But most of all, as when I began to speak, and I made the supplication to Avalokiteshvara and compassion, and so the most useful, sophisticated method of softening the self is to nurture compassion. And why is that? And that is the minute we start beginning to think of somebody else, the sense of ourself softens. And today we know from Western scientific methods, what the ancient yogis had perhaps only intuited, are two very critical things. And that when psychiatrists interview people who have mental problems or are feeling challenged, whether it is by COVID or a relationship gone sour, their conversation is obsessed with the I, me, mine. There is a very exaggerated sense of the self that is experiencing whatever pain, discomfort, or lack that troubles and they tend to articulate. We also know that the minute you start thinking of somebody else, if at the very least you're distracted from the sense of the I that suffers. But what really happens is even more interesting, and I don't know if there are any neuroscientists in the small audience, but we know now are now aware of the neuroplasticity of the brain. We were earlier on, quite recently, given to understand that the brain was frozen and nothing could happen to the physical structure of the brain. And it was only the sort of more subtle aspect of the biochemistry of the brain that you could alter. I mean, a recent article in The Economist is now dismissing the role of serotonin and saying that was a misplaced hypothesis. Because ultimately it is a hypothesis. You're not really able to go into the brain and take it apart and measure all the chemicals that go across the synapses of the brain. You make certain assumptions. And those assumptions now tell us that that is not the case. However, they have done studies of the physiology of the brain and seen changes in the brains of those who do sustained practices on compassion. Now, what do I mean by all these ideas? And they come under the larger matrix of meditation. And so meditation is now extremely fashionable, and certainly mindfulness meditation. And however, in our tradition, mindfulness meditation is a very small prerequisite for the larger aspiration of meditation, which is, like I said, training the mind. Now, what is the function of the brain? And what does the brain respond to in very elemental psychology? Is that whether you believe in reincarnation, whether you say it is genes. I was just talking to a wonderful professor a short time ago, who was telling me that how genes are, what you're born with, and then depending on your thought processes, they produce proteins that will then impact the nature of your disease and what you experience and what you go through. So what happens in meditation is that just like, if I were to want to build up these biceps, I would have to exercise my arm. Or if I wanted to lose weight, I would need to watch my diet, and I would need to exercise. Now the brain, the structure, the physiology of the brain in some ways is not very different. So if I have ulcers, I need to change my physiological diet so that I have foods that are not as acidic and do not lead to the production of excess acids that cause ulcers. In the short term, I can take medication that may suppress the ulcers, but if I don't change my diet, the ulcers will keep coming back. And the same is true of the brain. That if I'm suffering from depression or whatever imbalance in the brain, and we are no longer sure that it has to do with serotonin and serotonin uptake and uptake transmitters or what have you, but the principle remains that I can take medication and it may give me some relief by altering in subtle ways the biochemistry of the brain. But if I don't change my mental diet, then that is going to keep coming back. And what do I mean by mental diet? What I mean by mental diet is just that I consciously choose to move my arm up and down in order to flex these muscles. I can equally choose in meditation, once I have reached a certain level of quietude through whatever method, whether it's breath or yoga or just sitting silently, that I then choose to plant certain thoughts in my mind. And the basic thoughts that I just mentioned to you relate to impermanence, relate to understanding interdependence, and the nurturing of compassion. And these are the values that His Holiness embodies. Now you would imagine that someone who is considered an incarnation or an embodiment of the Buddha aspect of compassion, a living Buddha, he still continues, at least till pre-COVID, I haven't met him since COVID ceased, to do 5 to 7 hours of practice every day. So it isn't something that you do and then you can stop doing because it's all settled down, just like your body weight. So if someone like the Dalai Lama can spend that many hours every day in order to train his mind, given what he brings to the table, it surely demands that we put in some hard work too. And unless we train our minds in order to be compassionate and to see the true nature of reality, interdependence, interconnectedness, we will find that we will continue to experience the suffering of suffering. And so, I've been a student of His Holiness for about 35, 40 years. And the narrative I usually use to end with is that whenever I see His Holiness, he will always whisper into my ear, practice, practice, practice. Because without practice, I could try and share my experience of doomsday, and it will end up being doomsday for all of us if we don't practice in whatever form and manner is appropriate for us. And so that also points to the fact that when I say that whatever form or manner is appropriate to us, there's just like each of us needs a different physical diet, each one of us needs a different mental diet. So we're not arguing for our particular approach to the kind of mental diet that everybody should have. And it is this openness that enables the Dalai Lama to go to the mosque and do the namaz, to go to a church and sing a Christian hymn, and to be able to be all-embracing and inclusive, recognizing with humility that what his student is sharing with you today is not the only way or the highway. However, there are some eternal guiding principles. We know that the food we eat and the exercise that we do will determine our body weight. So similarly, we know that different kinds of food affect people differently, and different forms of exercise are appropriate for different people. So it isn't one size fits all, and the great risk in contemporary materialist societies is what we describe as spiritual materialism, where the spiritual quest, which really is the quest for equanimity, is overwhelmed by the American dream and the American mandate for happiness. And so what we're really talking about is not just happiness and suffering, but the contentment or the equilibrium or the equipoise of our state of mind, because I would argue that when you are really happy, you're not really conscious you're happy, because the elements of your happiness are transient. And if your happiness is purely in response to a new car, a new relationship, a new whatever, or a change in whatever, it will not, cannot sustain. Because impermanence, interdependence, and interconnectedness are the essence of the human condition. And it is foolish for us not to see, this is not about faith, it's not about religion. It is about pure reason and logic. So just as we know that if we put our finger into a flame of fire, it'll burn, reason and logic should tell us that if we don't recognize the true nature of reality that circumscribes our existence, we cannot, will not, and shall not find equipoise. And when I say equipoise, I do not for a moment mean that there is any way that we can avoid. If the great masters couldn't do that, I don't think any of us can. People who spent their lifetimes in training the mind go through the disease of cancer, heart attacks, or what have you. But what they're able to change is their relationship to it. So there's nothing that we can do to find, to exclude any form of the unpleasant, or whatever word you want to use, craving, suffering. There are many, many synonyms for that in our lives. So I can only end with the exhortation to practice, practice, practice. It doesn't matter what you practice, you have to find and take responsibility for your own practice, because there is a huge temptation to abdicate that choice to our partner, to our doctor, to our teacher, to whoever it is. We cannot abdicate that responsibility. And we have to be extremely conscious of spiritual materialism, because one of the greatest obstacles to the spiritual growth across certainly our civilizational heritage is when people report peak spiritual experiences. They are the most dangerous obstacles to spiritual evolution for a very simple reason. They may or may not have significance, but the minute you attach significance and you are able to you report with pride that, look, I am feeling X, or I have seen a light, or my body has been through a vibration. What you're really doing is you're freezing that experience and trying to recreate it each time to reassure yourself that you have somehow evolved on a spiritual path. It is not a linear evolution. It goes through, like everything else in life, it goes through the graph of up and down and down and up. And so I just wish you a happy journey, and I'm sorry that this has been a very short snapshot of a very exhaustive, complex process. If you have any questions, I think we have about 5 minutes left, and we're happy to try and respond to them. And Avik at the back holds the mic.
In your experience in meeting the Holiness Dalai Lama and your vast experience of spirituality, have you seen or experienced anybody who has somehow garnished the ability to control the autonomic nervous system?
Yes, of course.
And
it's very routine. I mean, at the higher realms of practice, it is really par for the course in advanced practice, and it's extremely dangerous, of course, to attempt it and aspire to them till it naturally happens. Some of it seems bizarre, to people. In fact, if you went to the net There is an award-winning new film called Thukdam, Thukdam. Look out for it. It's just been at 3 or 4 festivals and doing really well, which looks at Tibetan monks who have been declared clinically dead, and still, you can still measure ECG in their brains. Their bodies don't cool down, and we believe, and actually it's not that we believe, we have seen, and then the belief follows from what we have seen, that so we have seen this to be, I wouldn't say a common occurrence, but every 4 to 6 months there is now located in Dharamsala with substantial Russian funding, who are people because they're looking more aggressively at the transnormal than most other scientists are willing to look at. There is a rapid action force that the minute news comes in of a monk who has gone into this state of being, they rush in there and then they monitor what is happening to the physiology. But what we believe, and we can't actually know till we've gone through it ourselves, is that the aspiration of a bodhisattva, which means that someone whose life is dedicated to teach and serving humanity, is so powerful and so strong that they can direct their consciousness at the time of death in order to take rebirth in a form and manner that will teach and serve humanity. So this is that transient period that we call the bardo, during which the monk is steering his consciousness into the next rebirth. And that is how, in fact, the whole idea of the reincarnation of the Dalai Lamas exists for us.
So, besides that, in daily living, that is the end of the life path, but in daily living, have you seen people meditate and do yoga to somehow control some of their autonomic nervous system for a fruitful purpose of wellness and health?
The idea is that I don't know. I mean, I know that people are, I have seen, like I said, the phenomena of Thukdam myself. I have read first-person narratives. I have seen briefly, yogi, as I said with Mr. Iyengar himself, that he could slow down his breathing to virtually nothing, very, very slow rate of breathing. And certainly in the Himalayas, it would defy all logic as to how someone can sit on ice and purely through body heat be able to melt the ice, melt the ice. So there are several elements that defy conventional wisdom, yes, that I have seen and observed and read about a lot more.
I'll give you 2 comments. One is Acharya Brahmachari, who used to be the fellow who became the guru of Indira Gandhi, a picture was taken when he was walking in the streets of Moscow during the winter months with nothing but a dhoti. And he was out there for like 10 minutes. Most people thought he'd be dead in 3 minutes. So that was, I guess, he was commercializing his art. The second, I have seen it with my own eyes. About 30 plus years ago, an ascetic that came down and got himself into a concrete box and was able to stay. The air there was only for 3 hours. That person was there for 3 or 4 times the normal time and had slowed down their heart rate and breathing. He was being monitored. So those are my experiences.
But what's critical in spiritual terms is not the ability to do it per se, but the motivation for doing so. And if the motivation for doing so is to show off, then you might achieve, if you want to walk the streets of Moscow so that people can see what you're doing and think very highly of you. That may not have been the case. I'm not assigning any particular motivation to anybody. But if the motivation is to demonstrate that you have a unique power, then it's counterintuitive and it will reinforce the sense of the self. So controlling the autonomous nervous system is really a mechanism to enable the concentration and the consciousness to become more acute and more refined and not be distracted by bodily functions. But it is also possible to do it as a circus exercise. So we are all...
Hello everybody, thank you for coming and for the very nice information that we got today. We know how powerful is the brain, right?
Sorry? How powerful?
We know how powerful is our brain.
Yes.
And how much it can change a lot of things. We come from a lot of backgrounds and from different countries and civilization. Why don't we get together, with our different backgrounds and do some kind of like institute or some kind of education for people to train their brain, not focused on any kind of belief or religion, but focused on, benefiting the humanity in general, so people can get out of the suffer. So I wanted just to take your input about that and how can we make it happen, because part of compassion is to do something, right, and be in action. So what are we doing to train everybody to get out of their suffering?
Well, a lot is happening, and including the foundation that I am privileged to serve. We have a very emphatic program which is developed. We just call it, we're calling it secular values and secular techniques, which are run by people of different traditions. So, because the minute there is an aura of any particular faith or tradition, the others tend to resist it. So, for example, all the elements that I spoke about, interdependence and impermanence or what have you, are really universal principles. And so we're not going into, for example, what happens after death, because different traditions have different projections as to what happens after you die, or the idea of reincarnation. And so we hold back on the idea of reincarnation, for example, and because we explain reincarnation in the sense that all our actions, as modern psychiatry tells us, and more than our actions, our intentions leave imprints in our consciousness. So we might say that it's wrong to tell a lie, but if I'm in a space where a mob is trying to chase someone from a minority community who I'm giving refuge to, and I lie about his presence, then the imprint of my consciousness will be different to someone that I was lying to for personal gain. So there is this whole, maybe again for tomorrow, another day, to see that when we feed this mental diet, and it's got nothing to do with your particular faith per se, is the motivation or what your faith tells you that creates the imprints in your consciousness that predisposes you to further action. That's what modern psychology tells us, and which is why modern psychiatric methods try to bring that to surface, so what is causing you trauma gets released. But what often happens, we believe, that when that is released, you may not be in the position to handle what is released. So we rather work with the system of antidotes, and we find that the universal antidote, sort of the lining in the stomach that prevents it from acidity, is compassion. Because we found that in our engagement with different religious traditions was that there was unanimous agreement on the imperative of compassion and the value that it had. And just a final, another illustration of this idea of inclusiveness, I don't know if you're aware of the Ajmer Sharif, the Sufi shrine in India, that goes back 700-800 years. So His Holiness was visiting the shrine, and here's an agnostic. And so he went to this Khwaja Sahib, who was the founder of this tradition, and he prostrated and he meditated. He prayed for 15 minutes with his head resting on the feet of where the shrine was. And he got up and said, I have just experienced divinity, his divinity, even though he was an agnostic. So what it really calls for is our willingness to acknowledge, first, that we each need different mental diets, and then to look at what are the common strands in that mental diet that we can then encourage and nurture in people. And I think a lot of attempts have been made, but there has been a great deal of resistance, including in this country, where I think the American Constitution is nervous when you have 10 minutes of silence in school, lest God creep into it. So there are different forms of resistance in different cultures. But the aspiration is certainly the driving principle for our work at our foundation and certainly for His Holiness. Thank you.